Quite a few people have been saying that Schiit Audio's Mimir DAC is the best value DAC to get under $1,000, and I wanted to find out for myself. Now, I actually wanted to do this last year, but Schiit Audio was changing over from having someone else make their circuit boards to doing them in-house, and they had somewhat of a lack of stock, so I only got it earlier this year. But since then, I've been doing some listening with it and doing some comparisons, and well, I can certainly say my impressions have been, well, quite interesting. Now, I have to say I appreciate being able to do the Vestry review first, as that gave me an idea of what I wanted to say about the Mimir DAC. Now, at $299, it's certainly relatively inexpensive. Actually, the chassis of it reminds me of, well, not audio gear, but other types of equipment that I used to have in the house when I was a child. It has very basic aluminium and steel chassis, and that's because all the effort has gone pretty much into the technology inside, rather than making fancy and pretty chassis that look impressive, that either add to the price or take away from money used for components. One of the most handy features of the Mimir, though, is that you can buy the optional $50 Forkbeard module. And this turns the DAC into a preamp as well, and also adds EQ, non-oversampling, phase inversion, and the like, making it quite a flexible unit. However, for your $299, you do get quite a few options as far as input goes, with your standard AES, SPDIF and optical, and you get Schiit Audio's proprietary unison USB system with up to 384 kHz input. Now, while that number sounds impressive, Schiit Audio has traditionally only had up to 192 kHz input on their DACs, and that's because all standard music, including streaming music, only goes up to 192K. So there was no point in having higher res input, although after some demand, Schiit Audio have put it in there, and that's because if you do have the Forkbeard module, you can set it in non-oversampling mode and use external upsampling. Though I think at the $299 price point, that's not something that people will really consider. It's the kind of DAC designed for, like all Schiit Audio DACs, you plug it in and can use it without having to worry about all the Audiofilio Universo stuff, such as external upsampling or fancy power or fancy cables and the like, as it only has an AC input, and that's not even DC. Similarly, one of the interesting criticisms I've heard of Schiit Audio DACs is that the USB input is USB-C, but I think everyone's actually wrong. One of the things a lot of people have are fancy USB cables for connecting their DACs. However, with a USB-C connector, you don't need to buy some unknown fancy USB-C cable from some audiophile manufacturer, which actually sometimes can turn out not to be to USB spec and can actually make things worse. But you can buy things like high-speed USB 3, USB 4 and Thunderbolt cables, which will have higher frequency transmission and better shielding and genuinely improve transmission through. However, the Unison USB system is designed to eliminate any of those differences and just be good at whatever you have, as long as it's to spec and as long as there aren't any major issues with your computer or source. But speaking of that, Schiit Audio DACs do have their own proprietary digital filter in them, a filter designed by the legendary Mike Moffat, who also designed his own analog to digital converter for studios, the Gain 1 system, with which a lot of amazing albums were recorded. If you could listen to some of those albums, the sound is so unique and just awesome to listen to. Now, while Mike has retired, his technology lives on in the mesh system. Now, to that end, your source, whether it be your phone, tablet, or a computer, should be outputting the same sample and bit rate as the actual music. So if you have a standard, what we call CD quality, 16-bit 44.1 kHz file that it's playing back, your source should be outputting that for optimum results. Very often, computer resampling can degrade the signal enough that you won't get the benefits of the digital filters inside the Mimir and other Schiit Audio DACs. Now, we previously looked at that in the ASCART X, in the mesh card, also in Schiit Audio's Vestry, which I think is one of the most amazing dongle DACs you can get for $99 as far as sound quality concerned, although people don't like the controls. With the Mimir, the only control you have is the input selector, because features such as non-oversampling, which was available on some other of Schiit Audio's DACs, is now only available in the Forkbeard module. And that leads to the question, is it really that amazing under $1,000? And I think fairly well that it is. Now I'm glad I had the chance to listen with the vestry and review that first, as it helped me decide how I was going to describe the experience with the Mimir. Now, like I described in my Asgard X video, the Mimir is a step up from the mesh card with more depth and detail to the sound. One of the primary things that I find that the Mimir has over generic DACs is that the proprietary time domain correct digital filter designed by Mike Moffat overcomes two issues that I have with generic DACs. The first is instrument timbre. I tend to find that generic DACs have an issue reproducing things like piano, violin, and percussion, which sounds slightly unnatural through those DACs, but it sounds more real through something like the Mimir and even the vestry, even if they aren't quite as resolving as some of the better DACs I have here. The other thing is the realism of the soundstage with a time domain correct filter. And the reason for that is when sounds arrive at your ear and your brain determine where those sounds are coming from, how far away they are or how close they are, and how far to the left and to the right. If you have issues with time domain, then the sounds aren't arriving in your brain with the correct timing, and your ability to discern what a sound stage is like is severely inhibited, and that's a problem I find with generic DACs. However, the time domain corrected filters in DACs such as the Mimir mean that I can hear the soundstage more accurately and the placement of instruments and singers more accurately, and the overall result is that the music sounds more real. So then, what about Schiit Audio's other DACs? Now, I compared it to the Bifrost 264, which also has Schiit Audio's proprietary digital filter and unison USB, but it uses a industrial R2R DAC chip compared to the modern ESS Tech DAC that's inside the Mimir. Now, the problem with that Bifrost 264 is, switched on cold, it sounds considerably different to if it's been on an hour or a couple of hours, or at least initially when purchased, even a week. And the reason for this is perfectly logical. R2R DACs use a series of resistors, and resistors, depending on their temperature, will change their value slightly, and thus the output can be changed significantly enough that it's readily audible, even measurably audible. Now, I guess high quality industrial machines account for this in how they're designed. R2R DACs are used for motor control most often, but in something that's only relatively inexpensive, that kind of temperature control is just not available, and you just have to leave them on and kind of hope for the best. It was interesting to compare both the Mimir and the Bifrost 264, which I left on for a week just to ensure that any of those differences were eliminated. Now, in comparing with the Mimir, I was somewhat surprised to find that the Bifrost 264, while making the music sound a little bit more mellow, tended to have some subtle impreciseness in how it delivered each note and the subtleties of each note, where there was generally more sense of accuracy and precision coming from the Mimir. Now, this isn't quite so much a surprise. I remember way back a manufacturer who designed R2R DACs, when he switched from an old R2R PCM 1704 UK to designing one of his DACs with an ESS Tech DAC, he said that the ESS Tech DAC made singers sound younger. And that's probably not a bad description, I reckon, for the effect of listening with the Mimir versus the Bifrost 264. Everything sounds a little bit more youthful, and some people might say brighter, but I don't like that terminology. I tend to still find the Schiit Audio DACs to not have a general brightness or sharpness unnecessarily. That more youthful sound, in comparison to the Bifrost 264, was definitely more accurate sounding. However, one of the things I kind of miss, and I think a lot of other people do too, I could exemplify by the fact you can see there's an old Schiit Audio Jotunheim 2 behind me, and inside that is a multi-bit card. Now, the multi-bit cards were not particularly detailed, but they had this enjoyable mellowness about how they presented the music that made them very easy to listen with. So the old Jotunheim 2, for example, with the old Bifrost 2, not the current Bifrost 264, was a very mellow combination that was very enjoyable to listen with. And the new, more youthful sound from something like the Mesh DAC and the Jotunheim 3, in some ways, while it's technically better, in a couple of respects is a tiny bit less what you might call musical. But part of me does kind of miss that old school sound that you do get from DACs such as the Bifrost 2 and their other R2R DACs. I've seen a few people buy the Mimir to use with the Asgard X. In my experimentation, while I don't think it matters so much with the Asgard X, I did plug both the XLR outputs and the RCA outputs into the Mjolnir and other amplifiers, And while I had to switch between different volume levels to compare them, because the output of RCA is lower than XLR, actually half the output at 2 volts versus 4 volts, I do have a couple of amps here where I could compare them at set volume levels to get exactly the same level. And there was a touch better depth and delineation of instruments from the XLR outputs versus the RCA. So I'd say if you are buying a Mimir, if you can, use the XLR outputs on there for best results. And choosing between, say, a Mimir and or just buying, say, a Jotunheim or Asgard X with a mesh DAC card in there, the Mimir steps up from the mesh DAC card with better depth and detail from the sound. Like I said in my Asgard X video, if you're choosing between something like an Asgard X with mesh DAC card versus a Jotunheim with the Mimir, there's a significant enough jump up that I would say go for the Jotunheim and Mimir, as that's going to be more optimum. And if you're wondering about, well, yeah, in the future I might want a Mjolnir, and just go for the big one first. That's my advice. Now, while I don't have a Gungnir here to compare, I generally say that of the DACs I have had here under $1,000, the Mimir has been the best one so far. Now, while it may not satisfy people who want a more warmer and mellow sounding DAC, for them maybe a non-oversampling DAC might be better, as even in non-oversampling mode, you only lose a little bit of precision out of the DAC versus having the digital filter switched on. I think the main thing about the Mimir is having the ability, if you buy the Forkbeard system, to having things like EQ, especially if you're a headphone listener like me, and where sometimes you just want something like a little bit more bass or a little bit less treble, and the 3-band EQ that's built into the Forkbeard gives it a huge advantage. So yes, the Mimir is that good if you like a modern sounding DAC with good measurements, but also can deliver instrument timbre and soundstage accuracy for relatively little money. The tech that's in this is pretty fantastic. Thanks to all my patrons and supporters, Bloom Audio and Campfire Audio for supporting my channel, and Schiit Audio for supporting my show reports, as well as sending me the Mimir and other gear to review. As always, I invite owners of the Mimir to post their own impressions in the comments, which helps make my review useful for people looking to buy the products I'm reviewing. As always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to seeing you at a Can Jam.